There is a photo almost every Australian family has somewhere. A single house, a father in a factory uniform, a mother surrounded by 5 kids, one income, no second job. The caption underneath when people share it online is almost always the same. Things were simpler then. So here is the question almost nobody asks about that photo. The wage that built that household wasn't even calculated for 5 children. So why did the maths somehow work for more kids than the system was designed to support? The answer is not thrift, and it is not simpler times. It is a wage system explicitly engineered around a specific number of dependents, and most families in that era had more dependents than the number the system was built for. Here is what we found. In 1907, an Australian industrial court case, known as the Harvester Judgment, set the foundation for the basic wage in this country. Justice Henry Bourne-Higgins calculated what a single wage needed to cover for a human being in a civilized community, specifically a wife and 3 children, at a modest standard of living. That number 3 became the baseline the entire wage-fixing system was built around for decades. But Australia's total fertility rate during the post-war baby boom averaged well above 3 children per family, closer to 3.5 with families of 5, 6 or more children common in working-class households through the 1950s and 60s. The wage was indexed to support 3 dependents. A large share of the households cashing that wage were supporting more. If the basic wage was mathematically built for 3 children and millions of Australian families had 5, what closed that gap? And why does the exact same gap make a single income impossible today? To understand what closed it, the 1 income 5 kids household needs to be examined as an economic structure with at least 3 load-bearing components, not 2 and not luck. The first component was the wage itself, indexed to a 3-child baseline. The second component was unpaid domestic labour, cooking from raw ingredients, sewing and mending clothes, childcare with no market price attached. The third component is the one almost nobody names because it sounds uncomfortable stated plainly. Each additional child past the baseline cost the household progressively less than the one before it. We call this the marginal child discount. Housing was already paid for. A 4th or 5th child didn't require a new mortgage, just a fuller bedroom. Clothes, prams, cots and toys passed down from older children to younger ones at close to 0 additional cost. Food scaled in bulk far more efficiently than fixed housing and durable goods costs did. The first child was the expensive one. Every child after that was cheaper to add than the system's own wage-fixing courts had assumed when they calculated for 3. Here's a number that breaks the nostalgia. Economists studying household economies of scale consistently find that the marginal cost of an additional child drops sharply after the first 1 or 2, because the most expensive fixed costs, housing, a stove, a washing machine, school enrollment infrastructure, are already paid for. A family that could afford 3 children on 1 wage, under 1950s cost structures, was often only a modest margin away from affording a 4th or 5th because none of the big fixed costs repeated. The basic wage was calculated for 3. Families could frequently stretch it to 5 not through extra income, but because children 4 and 5 were structurally the cheapest people in the household. The marginal child discount only worked because the domestic subsidy, the unpaid labour managing all 5 children, scaled with the family rather than the wage. The mother managing 3 children and the mother managing 5 were both unpaid. The system never had to price the difference. There was a 4th component too. Older children themselves became unpaid labour. In households with 5 kids, the eldest, often by age 10 or 12, was doing meaningful childcare, cooking and cleaning for the younger ones. Labour with no wage, no market price and no appearance in any economic statistic, but real enough that removing it would have required paying for formal childcare the household could never have afforded. This unpaid sibling labour was not incidental to the system. It was load-bearing in exactly the same way the mother's unpaid labour was. A 2nd and 3rd invisible worker stacked underneath the 1 wage everybody actually saw on a payslip. If 3 separate forms of unpaid and discounted labour were propping up the 1 income household, what happened when those forms of labour started disappearing? One at a time? This is where the design becomes visible, because every one of those load-bearing components was dismantled separately over roughly the same 50 years, and each removal is documented. Equal pay cases between 1969 and 1972 began closing the wage gap that had let employers treat male wages as the only ones worth indexing to household size. This was a necessary and overdue correction. But it also meant the basic wage stopped being calculated around a household model at all and started being calculated around an individual worker, with no equivalent mechanism reintroduced to price the unpaid domestic labour that the original system had quietly assumed for free. Female workforce participation in Australia sat at roughly 1 in 5 women through the 1950s and 60s. By the early 2020s, it had risen to more than 3 in 5. A BS and Reserve Bank research consistently linked this rise to the same underlying driver. Household expenses outgrew what a single wage could cover, so the unpaid labour inside the household, the domestic subsidy, was converted into paid labour outside it to bring in a second wage. Here's the part the dual income story leaves out entirely. When women entered paid work en masse from the 1970s through the 1990s, household borrowing capacity roughly doubled in aggregate because lenders now assess 2 incomes instead of 1. In a housing market with constrained supply, that capacity increase did not raise living standards. It raised prices. The median Australian house went from roughly 3 times a single income in the 1960s to roughly 8 times a median household income today. A household that, unlike the 1960s one, now has 2 wages paying it off. The second income didn't buy more house. It bought the same house at a price the market reset specifically to absorb that second income before the household ever benefited from it. We call this the second income absorption, the structural tendency for a market-wide increase in household borrowing capacity to be captured by asset prices rather than passed on as improved living standards. Once you know what to look for, you will find it in every "why can't we afford what our parents had" conversation, in every mortgage calculator that quietly assumes 2 incomes as the baseline, and in every modern household running 2 full-time jobs to service a single asset that one wage, stretched across 5 children, used to service alone. 3 mechanisms built the 1-income household with 5 kids: a wage indexed to 3 dependents, a discount on every child past the first 2, and an unpaid worker managing all of it for free. 2 of those 3 mechanisms were dismantled by the 1990s. The third, formal childcare pricing every hour a parent isn't home, was never built to replace what disappeared. If this is starting to sound less like a story about resilience and more like a story about which costs were simply never priced, stay with it, because the next part puts an exact number on what a modern household pays to replace what the old one got for free. Here is what this costs a household today, calculated specifically. Replacing the unpaid domestic labour that once came bundled free into a single-income 5-child household. Full-time childcare for multiple children, meal preparation from raw ingredients, household management. At current Australian market rates for those services runs into tens of thousands of dollars per year and scales upward, not downward, with each additional child, because none of today's formal childcare systems offer anything resembling the marginal child discount. This is the precise reversal of the original mechanism. In the 1950s household, child 5 was the cheapest person in the house. In a modern dual-income household paying for formal care, child 5 is priced at close to the same per-child rate as child 1. Because formal childcare doesn't share a bedroom, doesn't wear hand-me-downs, and doesn't get supervised for free by an older sibling. You can run a version of this calculation on your own household right now. Take what you spend on childcare, prepared food, and outsourced domestic tasks across a year, multiplied by the number of children old enough to require it, and that total is roughly the size of the combined subsidy a 5-child household in 1955 received for free. For most families with several young children, that number is not a fraction of a second income. It approaches the entire value of one, before that income has paid for anything else at all. This is not a hypothetical for households with more than 2 children. Family size compounds the gap exactly where the marginal child discount used to compound the savings. In reverse, a household with 5 children today is not facing 5 times the cost pressure of a household with 1. Depending on the ages involved, it can face 6, 7, or 8 times the pressure, because every additional child now arrives at full market price, with no sibling care, no hand-me-down economy, and no discount left anywhere in the system to absorb it. This is why the math of the old photo cannot simply be repeated by working harder or saving more. The 1-income household with 5 kids was never running on 1 income. It was running on 1 wage, indexed to 3 dependents, stretched across 5 children at a quietly discounted rate, managed entirely by an unpaid worker the system never had to price. Every one of those supports has since been removed, priced, or converted into paid labour, and none of them were replaced with an equivalent. This mechanism does not end at childcare pricing. There is a fourth layer sitting underneath all three of these collapsed supports: the tax and family payment settings that determine whether a larger family is actually better or worse off today after both the childcare costs and the effective tax rate on a second income are combined. The next investigation runs that exact calculation, family size by family size. So if neither thrift nor a second income nor the family payment system actually replaced what the photo was showing, what was it really showing? None of this is hidden. The harvester judgment and its three-dependent baseline are matters of public legal record. A BS fertility and workforce participation data is public. Housing economics research on the price effects of expanded mortgage capacity is published and peer-reviewed. The mechanism survives not because it's secret, but because "they raised 5 kids on one income, why can't you?" is a far more comfortable sentence than "the wage was built for 3, the rest was free labor, and the free labor is gone." The 1907 calculation assumed 3 dependents and an unpaid second worker managing them. Post-war families added 2 more children on top of that baseline because the marginal cost of doing so was nearly zero. Right up until every piece of the system that made it nearly zero was dismantled separately without anyone replacing it. The photo was never showing simplicity, and it was never showing 5 children supported by 1 income. It was showing 5 children supported by 1 wage, 1 unpaid worker, and a cost structure that has not existed for 50 years. And nobody ever sent a household today and noticed that it was gone. What you have seen today is the real architecture behind the 1-income household with 5 kids, a wage indexed to 3, stretched by a discount on every child after that, and managed entirely by labor nobody priced. It does not operate alone. Subscribe so the next investigation reaches you before the next childcare subsidy and family tax benefit review, when the settings that determine whether a larger family is viable at all will be decided again. Quietly, the same way the original wage was, in a room without that family in it.